The flames danced high into the night sky as Fiona Adams clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching helplessly as her entire life blazed before her eyes. The wagon that had carried her across 3 states, containing every earthly possession she owned, was now an inferno in the middle of the desolate Texas plains, miles from the promise of San Angelo where she'd planned to start anew. It had happened so quickly. One moment she had been sleeping beneath her wagon as she'd done every night of her journey. The next she was jolted awake by the acrid smell of smoke and the terrifying crack of wood succumbing to fire. A lantern she'd thought extinguished must have toppled in the night, igniting her carefully packed bundles of clothing and supplies. Now, standing a safe distance away, Fiona could only watch as orange flames consumed the canvas cover, licking at the wooden frame like a hungry beast. Her throat constricted with panic as she realized her mother's cherished silver locket remained inside, along with the last of her money, and the deed to the small plot of land she'd purchased sight unseen. "No," she whispered, taking a step forward, her face flushed with heat even from 20 paces away. The fire roared louder as if challenging her. The dry Texas air fed the flames, making them dance higher into the star-filled sky. In that moment of desperate consideration, she heard the thunder of hooves. A silhouette appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward her burning wagon. As the rider approached, she could make out a broad-shouldered man atop a magnificent palomino, his hat pulled low against the wind of his gallop. "Get back!" the stranger shouted, his voice deep and commanding as he pulled his horse to a stop and leapt from the saddle in one fluid motion. Before Fiona could protest or explain, the man had removed his duster and wrapped it around his arm. "My things," she started, but he cut her off with a sharp look. "The axle grease and ammunition will catch any second," he warned, already moving toward the inferno. "Stand clear," Fiona watched in astonishment as the stranger dove into the burning wagon, disappearing beneath the flaming canvas. Her heart hammered in her chest as seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Just as she took a step forward, ready to call out for him, the stranger emerged, clutching a leather satchel and a small wooden box. With a mighty crash, the wagon's support beams gave way. The stranger threw himself forward, rolling across the ground with his precious cargo as the wagon collapsed in on itself. Not 3 seconds later, a deafening boom split the night as the ammunition ignited, sending sparks and debris flying in all directions. The stranger shielded Fiona with his body as pieces of burning wood rained down around them. When the initial explosion subsided, he pulled back, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire. Dark eyes met hers, and Fiona felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with the smoke. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler now as he handed her the satchel and box. Fiona's eyes widened as she recognized her mother's lockbox and the satchel containing her documents and money. "No," she whispered, clutching the items to her chest. "How did you know which things to grab?" A smile tugged at one corner of his mouth as he removed his hat, revealing tousled dark hair. "I didn't. Just grabbed what looked important, figured papers and a locked box might mean something to someone foolish enough to travel these parts alone." "I'm not foolish," Fiona replied, lifting her chin despite the tears threatening to spill. "I'm determined." The stranger considered her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Vaughn Mitchell, at your service, miss." "Adams, Fiona Adams," she replied, accepting his handshake. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "And I believe you just saved more than my possessions, Mr. Mitchell. You may have saved my life." The wagon continued to burn behind them, illuminating the vast emptiness of the Texas plains. As Fiona stood there, hand in hand with a stranger whose timely arrival seemed nothing short of miraculous, she had no way of knowing that the destruction of her wagon was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of one far more profound than any she could have imagined. Vaughn Mitchell released her hand and surveyed the burning wreckage. "You're bound for San Angelo?" "Yes," Fiona replied, still clutching her rescued possessions. "I have land there, or at least the deed to some." She patted the leather satchel. "Thank you for saving this." "Without it, I would have nothing." Vaughn nodded, his expression somber in the firelight. We can't stay here. Fire this size might draw unwanted attention. Bandits patrol these stretches looking for travelers in distress. Fear flickered across Fiona's face. I hadn't considered that. Most don't until it's too late. Vaughn whistled softly and his palomino trotted over. We'll need to ride double. San Angelo's about 20 miles southwest. We can make it by morning if we push. Fiona hesitated, glancing at the stranger who had risked his life to save her possessions. In the world she'd left behind in Boston, the notion of riding through the night with an unknown man would be scandalous beyond measure. But this was Texas, 1875, and different rules applied to survival on the frontier. I don't have much choice, do I? She attempted a smile, trying to mask her unease. There's always a choice, Miss Adams, Vaughn replied seriously. You could stay here with the burning wagon and take your chances with whoever comes investigating, or you could trust the man who just pulled your valuables from the fire. Something in his direct gaze made her decision easier. When you put it that way, Mr. Mitchell, I believe I'll accept your offer of transportation. Vaughn secured her satchel and box to his saddle before mounting his horse with practiced ease. He extended his hand down to her. Give me your hand and put your foot on mine. Following his instructions, Fiona found herself swiftly pulled up behind him. The sudden proximity to this stranger made her breath catch. She awkwardly placed her hands at his sides, trying to maintain a proper distance despite their shared saddle. You'll fall off that way, Vaughn said matter-of-factly. Hold on to me properly, Miss Adams. Your reputation will survive, I assure you. Fiona reluctantly wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his cotton shirt. Is this appropriate enough, Mr. Mitchell? She felt rather than heard his chuckle. It'll do. He clicked his tongue and the palomino moved forward, leaving the burning wagon behind them. As they rode through the night, Fiona found herself grateful for the human contact after weeks of solitary travel. The rhythmic motion of the horse and the steady rise and fall of Vaughn's breathing gradually lulled her anxiety. Despite her best efforts to remain alert, exhaustion claimed her, and she found herself leaning more heavily against her rescuer's back. Where are you from, Miss Adams? Vaughn asked, his voice rumbling through his back into her cheek. Boston, she murmured. I came west after my father died. He left debts, and there was nothing for me there. And what awaits you in San Angelo? A fresh start, Fiona replied, watching the stars overhead. My father's cousin left me a small plot of land. I've never seen it, but the deed is legitimate. I plan to build something there. Ambitious for a woman alone, Vaughn observed, though his tone held no judgment. I've discovered I'm quite capable when necessity demands it, she replied with a hint of pride. And what about you, Mr. Mitchell? What brings you to these parts at such a fortuitous hour? There was a pause before he answered. I ranch about 5 miles outside San Angelo. Was returning from delivering cattle to Fort Concho when I saw your fire. Divine providence, Fiona murmured. Just good timing, Vaughn countered pragmatically. Though if you're the praying sort, I won't discourage your gratitude to the Almighty. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the vast Texas landscape stretching around them, illuminated by moonlight. Fiona found herself studying the silhouette of the man before her. Broad shoulders tapered to a lean waist, and even in the dim light, she could tell his hands were strong and capable as they held the reins with practiced ease. You mentioned your father passing, Vaughn said after a time. Is there family waiting for you in San Angelo? No, Fiona admitted. No family anywhere now. My mother died when I was 16. My father raised me alone until last winter. Influenza took him. I'm sorry to hear that, Vaughn said, and she believed him. It's not easy losing those we love. Something in his tone suggested personal experience with loss. Fiona wanted to ask, but fatigue was making her thoughts fuzzy. Her head drooped against his back. Rest if you need to, Miss Adams, Vaughn said softly. I'll make sure we arrive safely. I shouldn't, she protested weakly. Trust me, he replied. You'll need your strength for whatever comes next. Those words were the last Fiona remembered before drifting into an exhausted sleep. lulled by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the solid presence of the stranger who had rescued her from the flames. She awoke to gentle shaking and Vaughn's voice near her ear. "Miss Adams, we're approaching San Angelo." Fiona straightened, embarrassed to find she had been slumped against his back, her arms still wrapped around his waist. The first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky with pale golden light, revealing rolling hills and scattered mesquite trees. Ahead, the modest buildings of San Angelo came into view, nestled along the convergence of the Concho rivers. "I must look a fright," Fiona muttered, trying in vain to smooth her hair and brushing soot from her dress. "You look like a woman who survived a wagon fire," Vaughn replied with unexpected gentleness. No shame in that. As they rode into town, early risers were already about their business. A few curious glances were cast their way. A woman riding behind a man was bound to raise eyebrows, but Fiona found she cared less about propriety than she might have yesterday. "Where would you like me to take you?" Vaughn asked as they passed the general store and post office. Fiona realized she hadn't thought this far ahead. "I suppose I need to find the land office first to locate my property, and then perhaps a hotel if there is one." "There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Thornton," Vaughn suggested. "Respectable place for a lady, she might have a room available." He guided his horse to a modest two-story structure with a small porch. A sign reading "Thornton Boarding House" hung above the door. Before they had even dismounted, the front door opened, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Vaughn Mitchell," the woman called, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Fiona. "Don't tell me you've brought trouble to my doorstep before breakfast." Vaughn swung down from the saddle and helped Fiona dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "No trouble, Mrs. Thornton. Just a lady in need of lodging. Her wagon caught fire about 20 miles east. Complete loss." The woman's expression softened as she looked at Fiona. "Oh, you poor dear, come in, come in. You look like you could use a hot meal and a bath." "Thank you," Fiona said gratefully. "I can pay." She reached for her satchel, which Vaughn had already retrieved from his saddle. "We'll settle accounts after you've rested," Mrs. Thornton insisted, ushering her toward the door. Fiona turned back to Vaughn, suddenly reluctant to part from the man who had saved her life. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks necessary," he replied, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "Just glad I was passing by. Will I see you again?" The question slipped out before Fiona could consider its propriety. Something flickered in Vaughn's dark eyes. "San Angelo's a small town, Miss Adams. I suspect our paths will cross again." He tipped his hat to her. "Mrs. Thornton will take good care of you. I've got ranch matters to attend to." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Fiona standing on the boarding house porch with her salvaged possessions and an inexplicable sense of loss. "Well now," Mrs. Thornton said, eyeing Fiona with undisguised curiosity. "That's the most words I've heard Vaughn Mitchell string together in months. You must be something special." Fiona felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He saved my life, that's all." Mrs. Thornton made a noncommittal noise as she led Fiona inside. "Vaughn's one of the good ones, rare as they come in these parts. Now let's get you settled. You can tell me your story over breakfast." The interior of the boarding house was clean and modestly furnished, with a sitting room to the right and a dining room to the left. The scent of coffee and baking bread filled the air, making Fiona's stomach rumble with sudden hunger. "I have a room available on the second floor," Mrs. Thornton said, leading her up a narrow staircase. "It's small, but it's got a window that catches the morning light." The room was indeed small, but after weeks of sleeping beneath her wagon, it seemed luxurious to Fiona. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, a washstand with a porcelain basin against another, and a small wooden chair completed the furnishings. "This is perfect," Fiona said sincerely. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. Call me Harriet," the older woman replied. "Everyone does. I'll have hot water brought up for you to wash, and there's a dress of my daughter's that might fit you until you can get your own things in order." Left alone, Fiona set her satchel and lockbox on the bed and finally allowed herself a moment to process everything that had happened. In the space of one night, she had lost nearly everything she owned but gained her first ally in this new place. The memory of Vaughn Mitchell's strong arms pulling her from danger made her heart flutter in a way that both confused and exhilarated her. A knock at the door announced the arrival of hot water. Fiona washed away the soot and smoke, changed into the borrowed dress, a simple blue cotton that was slightly too large but clean, and made her way downstairs, following the enticing aroma of breakfast. In the dining room, she found Harriet serving coffee to three men in work clothes who glanced up with undisguised interest as she entered. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Adams," Harriet announced. "She'll be staying with us for a time." "Miss Adams, these are my regular boarders, Mr. Coleman, Mr. Porter, and Dr. Willis." Fiona nodded politely to each man as Harriet seated her at a small table apart from the men. "Miss Adams had some misfortune on the road," Harriet explained, pouring coffee for Fiona. "Vaughn Mitchell brought her in this morning." Mitchell, the eldest of the men whom Harriet had identified as Mr. Coleman, raised his eyebrows. "Must have been serious trouble if that lone wolf got involved." "My wagon caught fire," Fiona explained, deciding honesty was the best approach. "Mr. Mitchell happened to be passing by. He saved what he could before the ammunition exploded." The men exchanged glances. "Lucky for you he was there," Dr. Willis commented. "Mitchell's ranch is a fair distance from the main road." "I gathered he doesn't come to town often," Fiona said, accepting a plate of eggs and biscuits from Harriet. "Only when necessary," Harriet confirmed. "Keeps to himself mostly." Since she stopped abruptly, busying herself with the coffee pot, Fiona's curiosity was piqued, but she didn't press. Instead, she focused on her breakfast, realizing how ravenous she was after the night's ordeal. "What brings you to San Angelo, Miss Adams?" Mr. Porter asked. He was the youngest of the three men, perhaps 30, with friendly eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. "I inherited a plot of land from my father's cousin," she explained. "I need to visit the land office to determine its exact location." "Simmons at the land office opens at 9, Dr. Willis offered. "I'd be happy to walk you over there when you're ready." "Thank you, but I'll manage," Fiona replied, not wanting to impose. "I'm accustomed to handling my affairs." The men seemed to accept this without offense, finishing their breakfast and departing for their respective jobs with polite nods to Fiona. When they had gone, Harriet sat across from her with her own cup of coffee. "Now, tell me everything," the older woman said, "and don't leave out a single detail about how you ended up riding into town with Vaughn Mitchell." Fiona found herself recounting the events of the night, from the terrifying moment she'd awakened to flames to Vaughn's heroic rescue and their overnight journey. Harriet listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions or making sympathetic noises. "Well," Harriet said when Fiona had finished, "you've had quite an introduction to San Angelo. What are your plans now?" "Find my land and build something on it," Fiona said with more confidence than she felt. "I brought enough money to get started, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "What kind of something did you have in mind?" Fiona hesitated. "In Boston, I assisted my father in his bookshop. I thought perhaps San Angelo might need a bookstore and lending library." Harriet's eyes widened. "Books out here, people read everywhere," Fiona said defensively. "Education shouldn't end at the Mississippi River." To her surprise, Harriet laughed warmly. "Oh, I like you, Miss Adams. You've got spirit, and you're right, this town could use more books and fewer saloons, but building a business like that takes time and money." "I'm prepared for that," Fiona insisted. "Well, you're welcome to stay here while you get your bearings," Harriet said, rising to clear the dishes. "I charge $4 a week, meals included." "Fair enough, more than fair," Fiona agreed. "Thank you, Harriet." After helping with the dishes over Harriet's protests, Fiona set out to find the land office. San Angelo was smaller than she'd imagined, but bustling with activity. Cowboys and townspeople moved purposefully along the main street, while wagons delivered goods to various businesses. The land office was located near the center of town, a small brick building with a sign identifying it as Simmons Land and Title. Inside, a balding man with spectacles looked up from his ledger as she entered. "Good morning," he greeted. "How can I assist you?" My name is Fiona Adams, she began, retrieving her deed from the satchel. I've inherited a property here and I'd like to confirm its location. Mr. Simmons examined the document carefully, consulting another large ledger book. Adams? Ah yes, this parcel came from Jacob Adams. My father's cousin, Fiona confirmed. I never met him, but my father corresponded with him occasionally. Well, Miss Adams, this is all in order, Mr. Simmons said, returning the deed. Your property is located about 2 miles northwest of town along the North Concho River. It's 10 acres, mostly cleared. There was a small cabin, but I believe it may have fallen into disrepair since Jacob's passing 3 years ago. Can you direct me to it? Fiona asked eagerly. Mr. Simmons sketched a simple map on a piece of paper. Follow the main road north out of town, then take the west fork at Cottonwood Creek. You'll see a lightning-struck oak that marks the southeast corner of the property. Fiona thanked him and left, studying the map as she walked. She would need to find transportation to visit her land, as well as supplies for whatever repairs the cabin might need. The reality of her situation was beginning to settle, and she was truly alone in a strange town, starting from almost nothing. As she turned a corner, lost in thought, she collided with someone, dropping her map. Looking up with an apology on her lips, she found herself face to face with Vaughn Mitchell. Miss Adams, he said, seeming as surprised as she was. I see you're finding your way around town. Mr. Mitchell, she replied, her heart beating a little faster at the sight of him in daylight. He was even more handsome than she'd thought, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. A faint scar ran along his jawline, only adding to his rugged appearance. He bent to retrieve her map, glancing at it before handing it back. Looking for your property? Yes, Mr. Simmons at the land office just showed me where it is. She hesitated, then added, I don't suppose you'd know of someone who might take me out there to see it. I'd pay, of course. Vaughn considered her for a moment. I could take you. Oh, I couldn't impose. It's no imposition, he interrupted. I know the area well. Jacob Adams' old place, isn't it? Just past Cottonwood Creek, Fiona nodded, surprised. You knew my father's cousin? Everyone knew everyone back then, Vaughn said with a shrug. San Angelo was even smaller 10 years ago. You've been here that long, born and raised, he confirmed. Left for a while during the war, came back in '66. Before Fiona could respond, a woman's voice called out, Vaughn Mitchell, is that really you in town 2 days in a row? They both turned to see a stylishly dressed woman approaching, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style beneath a feathered hat. Her dress, though appropriate for a respectable woman, was cut to flatter her figure, and she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to attention. Hello, Deanna, Vaughn greeted, his tone polite but noticeably cooler than when he'd addressed Fiona. I thought you were avoiding town these days, Deanna said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she glanced between Vaughn and Fiona. And who might this be? Miss Fiona Adams, Vaughn introduced. Recently arrived from Boston. Miss Adams, this is Deanna Palmer. Her father owns the bank. Charmed, Deanna said, extending a gloved hand. Boston, you are far from home. What brings you to our little corner of Texas? I've inherited some property, Fiona explained, feeling oddly defensive under Deanna's scrutiny. How fascinating, Deanna replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. Her attention returned to Vaughn. Father was wondering if you'd reconsidered his offer about the north pasture. My answer hasn't changed, Vaughn said firmly. Deanna sighed dramatically. You're as stubborn as that wild stallion you refuse to sell. One day you'll realize the benefits of progress, Vaughn. She turned to Fiona with a smile that didn't warm her eyes. Do enjoy your stay in San Angelo, Miss Adams. Our little town has so much to offer for those who understand its ways. With that, she continued down the street, the feather in her hat bobbing with each determined step. I apologize for Deanna, Vaughn said once she was out of earshot. She can be direct. No need to apologize, Fiona assured him, though she was curious about the exchange. Is her father trying to buy your land? Part of it, Vaughn admitted. He wants to expand his cattle operation, and my north pasture has the best water access. He seemed to shake off the subject, returning to their previous conversation. About your property, I can take you there tomorrow morning if you'd like. I have business to attend to today. That would be wonderful, Fiona said gratefully. Thank you. I'll come by the boarding house at 9, he said. Bring sturdy shoes, the trail can be rough. I will, she promised. An awkward silence fell between them before Fiona added, I should let you go about your business. Thank you again for the offer, Vaughn nodded, touching the brim of his hat. Until tomorrow, Miss Adams. As he walked away, Fiona found her gaze lingering on his retreating figure. There was something about Vaughn Mitchell that intrigued her, a quiet strength combined with unexpected kindness. The encounter with Deanna Palmer had revealed another side to him as well. A man of principle who stood his ground, even against powerful interests in town. Turning back toward the boarding house, Fiona felt a flutter of anticipation about tomorrow's journey. She would finally see her inheritance, the place that would become her home. And she would spend more time with the mysterious cowboy who had already saved her once. For the first time since her father's death, Fiona felt something like hope blossoming in her chest. San Angelo might just offer the fresh start she'd been seeking, despite her inauspicious arrival. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the October air crisp but not unpleasant. Fiona had risen early, too excited to sleep, and had changed twice before settling on her most practical outfit, a dark brown skirt of sturdy cotton and a cream-colored shirtwaist. She'd purchased sturdy boots the previous afternoon from the general store, along with a few other essentials to tide her over until she could replace the items lost in the fire. At precisely 9 o'clock, Harriet called up the stairs. Miss Adams, your escort has arrived. Fiona hurried down to find Vaughn waiting in the sitting room, hat in hand. He wore clean but well-worn clothes, denim trousers, a blue cotton shirt, and a leather vest. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly shaved that morning. Good morning, Mr. Mitchell, Fiona greeted, trying to ignore Harriet's obvious interest in their interaction. Miss Adams, he replied with a nod. Ready to see your property? Very much so, she confirmed. Outside, Fiona was surprised to find not Vaughn's horse but a modest buggy hitched to a steady-looking bay mare. I thought this might be more comfortable for you than riding double again, Vaughn explained, helping her up onto the seat. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Fiona. Thank you. That's very considerate. As they set off, the town quickly gave way to open countryside. The landscape was unlike anything Fiona had seen in the east, rolling hills covered in short grasses and scattered mesquite trees, with the occasional oak standing sentinel. The North Concho River glittered in the morning sun, its course marked by a line of cottonwoods and willows. It's beautiful, Fiona remarked, taking in the expansive sky that seemed to stretch forever. Different from Boston, I imagine, Vaughn said. Very different, she agreed. Everything there is so contained. Here, there's room to breathe. They followed the road north for about a mile before turning onto a less traveled track heading west. True to Mr. Simmons' directions, they soon came to a creek crossing, beyond which stood a massive oak tree, its upper branches blackened and twisted from a lightning strike. Cottonwood Creek, Vaughn announced. Your property begins just past that oak. As they crossed the creek, Fiona's excitement mounted. The track wound through a meadow dotted with wildflowers, then up a gentle rise. When they crested the hill, Vaughn stopped the buggy, allowing Fiona her first view of her inheritance. Below them, nestled in a small valley where the creek joined the river, stood a small cabin with a stone chimney. The roof appeared intact, though the porch sagged at one corner. A few outbuildings, a barn, and what might have been a chicken coop stood nearby, all showing signs of neglect but still standing. The land around the cabin was mostly cleared, with good grass and several mature pecan trees providing shade. Oh, Fiona breathed, tears unexpectedly springing to her eyes. It's perfect, Vaughn glanced at her, seeming surprised by her reaction. It needs work, he cautioned, been empty for 3 years. But it's mine, Fiona said simply, and it has good bones, doesn't it? A slight smile touched Vaughn's lips. It does at that. Jacob built it solid. Let's go take a closer look. He guided the buggy down the hill toward the cabin. As they approached, Fiona noticed the land sloped gently toward the river, providing natural drainage. The soil looked rich and wildflowers grew in abundance. Vaughn helped her down from the buggy and tied the horse to a hitching post that had somehow remained upright despite the years of neglect. Together, they approached the cabin. The porch steps creaked beneath their weight, but held firm. Vaughn tested the door, which was secured with a simple latch, and pushed it open, gesturing for Fiona to enter first. Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a loft area above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on 3 sides provided ample light. Dust covered everything, and a family of mice had clearly made themselves at home in one corner, but the structure itself appeared sound. "The roof hasn't leaked," Vaughn observed, looking up at the exposed beams. "That's good news." Fiona moved to the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. "It's bigger than I expected. Jacob was a bachelor, but he built with family in mind," Vaughn said, running his hand along the mantelpiece. "Never did marry, though. Did you know him well?" Fiona asked, curious about this relative she'd never met. "Well enough," Vaughn replied. "He was a fair man, kept to himself mostly, but would help a neighbor in need without being asked." He glanced at her. "You favor him a bit around the eyes." The observation pleased Fiona more than she would have expected. She'd always felt disconnected from her father's side of the family, and this tenuous link to her benefactor gave her a sense of belonging she hadn't anticipated. "What did he do here?" she asked, moving to examine the large cast iron stove in the corner. "Bit of everything," Vaughn said. "Kept some cattle, grew vegetables, did some carpentry work in town. He was good with his hands." He gestured toward a wooden chair near the fireplace. "Made most of the furniture himself." Fiona ran her fingers over the carefully carved back of the chair. "It's beautiful work." "He'd be pleased to know the place stayed in the family," Vaughn said quietly. "He spoke of his Eastern relations sometimes, though I don't recall him mentioning you specifically." "We never met," Fiona explained. "My father corresponded with him occasionally, but they weren't close. I was surprised to learn he'd left me the property." They explored the rest of the cabin together, discovering that the loft contained a sleeping area with a dusty but intact mattress frame. A trapdoor in the floor revealed a small root cellar, and a back door led to a covered area where firewood had once been stacked. Outside, they inspected the outbuildings. The barn was in reasonable condition, needing only minor repairs to some boards and a good sweeping. The chicken coop had fared worse, with part of its roof caved in, but Vaughn assured her it could be fixed without too much difficulty. "The well is the most important thing," he said, leading her to a stone-lined well with a hand pump. He worked the handle a few times, and after some initial resistance, water began to flow clear and sweet-smelling. "Good water and plenty of it. That's more valuable than gold out here." As they continued around the property, Vaughn pointed out various features, the best spots for a garden, the pecan trees that would provide nuts in the fall, the place where the river widened into a natural pool suitable for bathing in summer. Fiona found herself increasingly enchanted, not just with the property but with Vaughn's knowledge and his willingness to share it. He spoke with genuine appreciation for the land, and she sensed a deep connection to this place that went beyond mere familiarity. "Your ranch is nearby?" she asked as they paused near the river bank. "About 3 miles that way," Vaughn said, pointing northwest. "Not as pretty as this spot, but it has good grazing for cattle." "How large is it?" 500 acres, he answered. "My father started with 50, built it up over the years. I added to it after the war." "You fought in the war?" Fiona asked carefully, aware that the subject could be sensitive. "Confederate cavalry," Vaughn confirmed, his expression giving away little. "Came home in '65 to find my father had died and the ranch was barely hanging on. Took a few years to get back on our feet. My mother lived until 68, he explained. Just the 2 of us after my brother was killed at Shiloh." "I'm sorry," Fiona said softly, understanding better now the loss she'd sensed in him during their night ride. Vaughn merely nodded, his gaze on the river. After a moment he said, "What are your plans for this place? Will you sell it?" No, Fiona replied without hesitation. I mean to live here, make it my home. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if reassessing his initial impression. It won't be easy. Life out here is hard, especially for someone accustomed to city comforts. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Mitchell, Fiona said, lifting her chin, and I'm not afraid of hard work. A smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. I believe you, Miss Adams. But it takes more than strength and willingness to survive here. It takes knowledge. Then I'll learn, she said simply. I suspect there are people in San Angelo who might be willing to teach me what I need to know. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of something more. Then Vaughn looked away, scanning the horizon as if checking the time by the sun's position. We should head back soon, he said. There's a storm building to the west. Fiona followed his gaze and saw dark clouds gathering in the distance. Will it reach us today? Hard to say. Storms move fast out here, but that one's still a ways off. He turned back toward the cabin. We have time to make some basic measurements if you'd like to start planning repairs. For the next hour, they moved through the cabin methodically, with Vaughn pointing out what needed immediate attention and what could wait. He produced a small notebook from his pocket and sketched the layout, noting dimensions and materials that would be required. The stove pipe needs replacing, he observed, examining the rusted connection to the chimney. And you'll want new glass for that broken window before winter sets in. Winter, Fiona repeated, suddenly realizing she had no idea what to expect. How cold does it get here? Not as cold as Boston, Vaughn assured her, but we get our share of norther's cold fronts that can drop the temperature 30 degrees in an hour. Snow sometimes, but it rarely stays more than a day or two. By the time they finished their assessment, the storm clouds had moved closer and a cool breeze had picked up. We should go, Vaughn said, folding his notebook and returning it to his pocket. I can bring you back tomorrow if you'd like to start cleaning up. I would appreciate that, Fiona said, taking a last look around the cabin that would become her home. Though I hate to keep imposing on your time. It's no imposition, Vaughn replied as he held the door for her. I'd planned to check my fences on this side of my property anyway. As they settled into the buggy for the return journey, fat raindrops began to fall, pattering on the leather hood. Vaughn urged the horse to a trot, and they managed to reach the main road before the heavens truly opened. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dirt road into mud that sucked at the buggy wheels. Fiona clung to the seat as Vaughn navigated the increasingly treacherous conditions, his concentration absolute as he guided the horse through the worst stretches. Will we make it back? Fiona asked, raising her voice to be heard over the downpour. We'll make it, Vaughn assured her, though his furrowed brow suggested concern. Just might take longer than I planned. The rain continued unabated as they traveled, the temperature dropping noticeably with the storm. Fiona shivered, her lightweight shawl providing little protection against the chill. Without comment, Vaughn shrugged out of his leather vest and placed it around her shoulders, never taking his eyes from the road. Thank you, she said, touched by the gesture. The vest still held his warmth, and the faint scent of leather and something uniquely him horses and open air and clean soap. They rode in companionable silence after that, both focused on the journey. The rain gradually eased as they approached town, and by the time they reached the boarding house, it had dwindled to a light drizzle. Vaughn helped Fiona down from the buggy, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close, rain droplets clinging to his dark lashes as he looked down at her. Thank you for taking me today, Fiona said softly. For everything? You're welcome, he replied, his voice equally quiet. Then, seeming to remember himself, he stepped back, clearing his throat. I'll come by tomorrow morning if the roads aren't too washed out. Bring clothes you don't mind getting dirty. I will, she promised, reluctantly removing his vest and handing it back to him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Fiona felt that same inexplicable flutter in her chest she'd experienced the night he'd rescued her. Vaughn nodded once, then turned to remount the buggy. Fiona watched him drive away, already looking forward to the next day with an eagerness that had little to do with cleaning her new home. Inside, she found Harriet waiting with evident curiosity. "Well, how was it?" the older woman asked as Fiona removed her muddy boots. "Wonderful," Fiona replied honestly. "The cabin needs work, but it's sturdy and the land is beautiful. Mr. Mitchell was kind enough to help me assess what repairs are needed." Harriet's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Vaughn's a good man to have on your side." Not many would take time away from their own work to help a stranger. "We're not exactly strangers anymore," Fiona pointed out. "No, I suppose not," Harriet agreed with a small smile. "Come into the kitchen. I've got stew simmering, and you look like you could use something hot after being caught in that deluge." Over the next several days, a pattern emerged. Each morning, Vaughn would arrive with the buggy, sometimes bringing tools or supplies, and they would spend the day working on the cabin. Fiona insisted on paying for materials, but Vaughn refused any compensation for his labor, saying only that neighbors helped neighbors in Texas. They settled into an easy rhythm of work, Vaughn handling the heavier repairs while Fiona scrubbed, swept, and gradually transformed the dusty interior into a habitable space. She discovered an unexpected talent for practical matters, figuring out how to repair the chicken coop roof with salvaged materials, learning to operate the hand pump without flooding the yard, even helping Vaughn replace the broken window with glass purchased from the general store. In the evenings, they would return to town, Fiona to the boarding house and Vaughn to whatever mysterious life he led when not helping her. Sometimes they would stop at the general store together, where Fiona gradually accumulated the necessities for her new home: dishes, linens, basic foodstuffs that wouldn't spoil throughout these days. Fiona found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet cowboy. Vaughn wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and often unexpectedly insightful. She learned that he'd educated himself from books whenever possible, valuing knowledge despite his limited formal schooling. For his part, Vaughn seemed to soften in her presence. The reserved man who had first brought her to town gradually revealed glimpses of dry humor and occasional moments of tenderness that caught Fiona by surprise. The careful way he showed her how to build a fire that would last through the night. The wildflowers he silently placed on the newly scrubbed table one afternoon. The patient manner in which he taught her to identify the sounds of different animals in the darkness. After a week of steady work, the cabin was transformed. The floors gleamed from repeated scrubbings, the windows sparkled, and new curtains sewn by Fiona from fabric purchased at the mercantile hung at the windows. The stove had been cleaned and tested, the chimney swept, and a supply of firewood stacked neatly by the back door. Furniture remained sparse: Jacob's hand-crafted table and chairs, a bed frame with a new mattress Fiona had purchased, and a small bookshelf Vaughn had unexpectedly built and installed while she was in town one afternoon buying supplies. "For your bookstore inventory," he'd explained when she'd returned to find it mounted securely on the wall. "When you get it started." The thoughtfulness of the gesture had nearly brought tears to her eyes. She'd told him of her plans for a bookstore during one of their many conversations, but hadn't expected him to remember, much less act on it. On the 10th day after their first visit to the property, Vaughn arrived at the boarding house to find Fiona waiting on the porch with her trunk and the few possessions she'd accumulated since the wagon fire. "Moving day?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Fiona nodded. "The cabin is ready enough. I can't impose on Harriet's hospitality forever." "You're sure?" Vaughn studied her face. "Winter's coming, nights get cold." "I'll manage," she said confidently. "You've shown me how to bank the fire properly, and I have plenty of blankets." Vaughn nodded slowly. "Very well, let's get you settled then." They loaded her things into the buggy and set off for the last time, the journey now familiar to Fiona. As they approached her property, she felt a surge of pride at the sight of smoke curling from the chimney. Vaughn had ridden ahead earlier that morning to start a fire, so the cabin would be warm when she arrived. The interior looked welcoming, with the fire crackling in the hearth and sunlight streaming through the clean windows. Fiona's few possessions didn't take long to arrange, but by the time they'd finished, The short autumn day was waning. "I should go," Vaughn said reluctantly, standing by the door. "You've got everything you need." "Yes, thanks to you," Fiona replied, suddenly aware that this marked the end of their daily companionship. The thought left her feeling strangely bereft. Vaughn seemed to hesitate, then said, "I'll come by in a few days to check on you." "Make sure everything's working as it should." "I'd like that," Fiona said, perhaps too quickly. "I mean, I appreciate your concern." Another awkward silence fell between them, neither seeming ready to say goodbye. "I can never repay you for all you've done," Fiona finally said. "From pulling me from that burning wagon to helping me make this place a home." "No repayment necessary," Vaughn said gruffly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Fiona contradicted gently. "Not anyone. You're a rare man, Vaughn Mitchell." He looked at her then, something flickering in his dark eyes that made her heart beat faster. For a moment, she thought he might say more, might finally address the unspoken thing that had been growing between them over these days of shared work and quiet conversations. Instead, he reached for his hat. "Good night, Miss Adams. Bolt your door after I leave." "I will," she promised, hiding her disappointment. "Good night, Mr. Mitchell." After he'd gone, Fiona moved about the cabin, touching things they had repaired together, remembering moments shared over the past days. It felt strange to be truly alone for the first time since arriving in Texas. The cabin, despite its improvements, suddenly seemed very quiet and very empty. As darkness fell, Fiona lit the lamps they'd cleaned and filled, prepared a simple meal on the stove they'd repaired, and sat at the table Jacob had built, feeling both accomplished and oddly unsettled. She had achieved her goal, a home of her own, a place to start anew, yet something was missing. Or rather, someone. The realization that she had developed feelings for Vaughn Mitchell didn't come as a surprise exactly. She'd been aware of her growing attraction to him, had even admitted to herself that she looked forward to seeing him each day. But sitting alone in the cabin they had restored together, Fiona finally acknowledged the depth of those feelings. She had fallen in love with the quiet cowboy who had pulled her from the flames, who had taught her about this new land with patience and unexpected tenderness, who had worked alongside her without complaint or condescension. The question that troubled her now was whether he felt anything similar for her. Sometimes she thought she saw something in his eyes, a warmth, a longing that mirrored her own feelings. But Vaughn kept his emotions carefully contained, and she couldn't be certain. And now that the cabin was finished, she had no reason to expect his continued presence in her life. With these thoughts circling in her mind, Fiona prepared for her first night alone in her new home. She banked the fire as Vaughn had taught her, checked that the door was securely bolted, and climbed the ladder to the loft where her bed awaited. Despite her troubled thoughts, physical exhaustion soon claimed her, and Fiona fell into a deep sleep. She awoke to darkness and the distinct feeling that something was wrong. The air in the cabin felt different, cooler, with a faint, acrid smell that hadn't been present when she'd fallen asleep. Sitting up, Fiona strained to identify what had awakened her. A soft, crackling sound reached her ears, followed by a strange orange glow reflecting against the far wall of the loft. With sudden clarity, Fiona realized what was happening. Fire. Heart pounding, she scrambled from the bed and moved to the edge of the loft, peering down into the main room. The sight that greeted her sent ice through her veins. Flames licked along one wall of the cabin, consuming the curtains she had so carefully sewn and climbing rapidly toward the dry wooden ceiling. The fire was centered around the stove, where it appeared a spark had escaped and ignited nearby kindling. "No," Fiona whispered, panic rising in her throat. "Not again." For a paralyzing moment, she was back beside her burning wagon, watching helplessly as her possessions were consumed. Then training took over. Her father had always insisted on having a plan for fire in the bookstore, and she forced herself to think clearly. The ladder was still clear of flames. She could descend and reach the door, but the fire was spreading quickly. She needed to move now. Grabbing her shawl, Fiona wrapped it around her nightgown and hurried down the ladder. The heat was intense, and smoke was beginning to fill the upper portion of the room. Staying low, she moved toward the door, only to discover that the latch was hot to the touch. The fire had spread faster than she'd realized, potentially blocking her primary escape route. Turning, Fiona assessed her options. The windows were small but might provide an exit if necessary. She grabbed a chair and smashed it against the nearest window, shattering the glass they had so recently installed. Fresh air rushed in, but it only seemed to feed the flames, which leapt higher with the new oxygen source. Coughing as smoke filled her lungs, Fiona knew she had seconds, not minutes, to escape. She cleared the remaining glass from the window frame with her shawl and prepared to climb through. Just as she was hoisting herself onto the sill, the door burst open with a splintering crack. Through the smoke and flames, she saw a familiar silhouette. "Fiona," Vaughn's voice cut through the roar of the fire. "Where are you?" "Here," she called back, coughing as she inhaled more smoke. "By the window." In 3 long strides, Vaughn reached her, wrapping his damp bandana around her face. "Can you breathe?" he asked urgently. She nodded, the wet cloth filtering some of the smoke. "We need to go now," he said, taking her arm. "The roof won't hold much longer." Together they moved toward the door, Vaughn shielding her with his body as a burning beam crashed down behind them. They burst out into the cool night air just as a tremendous cracking sound came from within the cabin. Vaughn pulled Fiona away from the building, not stopping until they were a safe distance away. They turned to watch as, with a deafening crash, the roof of the cabin collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "Are you hurt?" Vaughn demanded, his hands moving over her arms and face, checking for injuries. "No," Fiona managed, still coughing. "Just smoke. How did you know?" "I didn't," he admitted, his voice rough. "I couldn't sleep. Something didn't feel right. I was halfway here when I saw the glow against the sky." Relief gave way to despair as Fiona watched her home, her fresh start burning before her eyes. "Everything," she whispered brokenly. "Gone again." Vaughn's arms came around her, strong and steady. "Not everything," he said fiercely. "You're alive, that's what matters." Fiona sagged against him, the full impact of what had happened beginning to register. Twice now she had lost nearly everything to fire. Twice now Vaughn Mitchell had appeared like some guardian angel to pull her from the flames. The stovepipe, she realized suddenly. "We replaced it, but maybe the connection to the chimney." "Don't think about that now," Vaughn said gently. "We can figure it out later." They stood together, watching as the fire gradually consumed what remained of the cabin. The stone chimney stood alone amid the destruction, a solitary monument to what had been. When the worst of the flames had died down, Vaughn led Fiona to where his horse waited. "We need to get you somewhere warm," he said, noticing her shiver. "You're in shock." "Where?" Fiona asked dully. "The boarding house is miles away." "My ranch," Vaughn said decisively. "It's closer." Too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue, Fiona allowed him to lift her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode away from the smoldering ruins, Fiona leaned back against Vaughn's chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. The journey to Vaughn's ranch passed in a blur for Fiona. When they finally arrived, she was only vaguely aware of a modest but well-maintained house emerging from the darkness, of being carried inside and settled in a chair before a fireplace. A cup of hot coffee was pressed into her hands, and gradually the warmth and the familiar bitter taste brought her back to herself. She looked around, taking in her surroundings for the first time. Vaughn's home was simply furnished but comfortable, with solid wooden furniture, shelves lined with books, and a distinct absence of feminine touches. It was clearly the home of a man who lived alone but who valued order and cleanliness. "Better?" Vaughn asked, crouching beside her chair. Fiona nodded, meeting his concerned gaze. "Thank you again." "Don't thank me," he said, his voice tight. "I should have checked the stove pipe connection more carefully." "It wasn't your fault," Fiona insisted. "These things happen, twice to the same person." Vaughn shook his head. "That's more than coincidence." "Perhaps it's fate," Fiona said softly, the words escaping before she could consider them. Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or a question. Before he could respond, a knock at the door drew his attention. "That'll be Eduardo," Vaughn said, rising. My ranch hand. I sent him to check if anything could be salvaged. He returned moments later with a middle-aged Mexican man who nodded respectfully to Fiona. Señorita, he greeted. I am sorry about your casa. Thank you, Fiona replied, appreciating his sympathy. The fire has mostly burned itself out, Eduardo reported to Vaughn. The stone walls and chimney still stand, but everything else. He shook his head. I found this, buried under some debris near the door. He handed over a familiar wooden box, her mother's lockbox, somehow survived yet another fire. Fiona accepted it with trembling hands. Gracias, she whispered, clutching the box to her chest. Eduardo nodded, exchanged a few quiet words with Vaughn in Spanish, then departed. You should rest, Vaughn said, turning back to Fiona. I've prepared the spare room for you. We can talk about what comes next in the morning. Too exhausted to argue, Fiona allowed him to lead her to a small but tidy bedroom. A nightshirt clearly Vaughn's had been laid out on the bed. It's all I have to offer, he apologized. We'll get you proper clothes tomorrow. It's perfect, Fiona assured him. Thank you for everything. Vaughn hesitated at the door. If you need anything in the night, I'll be fine, she promised, though in truth she felt anything but fine. The events of the night had left her shaken to her core. After Vaughn had gone, Fiona changed into the offered nightshirt, which hung to her knees and slipped beneath the covers. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames consuming her hopes and dreams. When dawn finally broke, Fiona rose and found one of Vaughn's shirts hanging on the back of the door, clearly left for her use. She put it on over her nightgown, rolled up the sleeves, and ventured out to find her host. Vaughn was in the kitchen, frying bacon and brewing coffee. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening at the sight of her in his clothes. You should have slept longer, he said by way of greeting. I couldn't, Fiona admitted, taking a seat at the table. Too much thinking. Vaughn nodded understanding as he placed a plate before her. Eat. Then we can talk about what happens next. The simple meal revived Fiona's spirits somewhat, and by the time they'd finished, she felt more capable of facing the challenges ahead. I need to go back, she said firmly. See what's left. I thought you might say that, Vaughn replied. The buggy's ready when you are. They rode in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the hill overlooking Fiona's property, she steeled herself for the sight of destruction. The cabin was indeed gone, reduced to a blackened rectangle surrounding the stone chimney. The outbuildings, spared from the blaze, stood as lonely sentinels to what had been. The good news is that the land itself is unharmed, Vaughn said quietly as they approached. And stone can be reused. We could rebuild. Fiona asked, glancing at him. Figure of speech, Vaughn said quickly, though a slight flush appeared on his cheekbones. You could rebuild, I mean, if that's what you want. Fiona was silent as they walked among the ruins. She knelt to touch a piece of the table Jacob had crafted, now reduced to charcoal. I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted. Coming west was supposed to be my fresh start. Now I've lost everything, twice. Not everything, Vaughn countered, crouching beside her. You have the land, you have your determination, and you have. He hesitated, then finished softly. You have friends here now. Fiona looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that gave her pause. Is that what we are, Vaughn, friends? His eyes held hers for a long moment before he glanced away. I'd like to think so. Rising to her feet, Fiona moved to the edge of the foundation, looking out over the land that was still hers. The river still flowed peacefully beyond the ruins, and birds sang in the pecan trees as if nothing had happened. I don't have the money to rebuild, she said finally. What I saved from the wagon fire won't be enough. There are options, Vaughn suggested carefully. The bank offers loans for construction. Deanna Palmer's father's bank, Fiona shook her head. I'd rather not be indebted there. Vaughn's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Can't blame you for that. They continued exploring the site, salvaging what little had survived the blaze, some metal cookware, tools from the barn, a few items that had been stored in the root cellar. It wasn't much, but it was something to build from. As midday approached, Vaughn suggested they stop for the meal he'd packed. They sat beneath one of the pecan trees, sharing bread, cheese, and dried beef in companionable silence. "What will you do now?" Vaughn finally asked, the question that had been hanging between them all morning. Fiona sighed, considering her options. "I could return to Boston, I suppose. There's nothing for me there, but at least it's familiar." "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted, surprising herself with her certainty. "No, I don't want to go back, despite everything I feel connected to this place, to San Angelo." She glanced at him, then quickly away. "To the people here." Vaughn was silent for so long that Fiona feared she'd said too much. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "I have a proposition for you." "Oh," Fiona looked at him curiously. "My ranch is doing well," he began. "The house is larger than I need, and I have the resources to help you rebuild here properly this time with no risk of fire." "I couldn't accept charity," Fiona said, though her heart leapt at the possibility of staying. "Not charity," Vaughn clarified. "A business arrangement. You mentioned wanting to open a bookshop. There's a vacant storefront on Main Street that would suit. I could advance you the money for both the shop and rebuilding your home in exchange for a share in the business until the loan is repaid." Fiona stared at him, stunned by the offer. "You would do that, for someone you barely know?" Vaughn met her gaze steadily. "I think I know you well enough, Fiona Adams. I've seen your determination, your resilience. Those are good qualities in a business partner." The way he said partner made Fiona wonder if he might be suggesting something more, but she didn't dare ask directly. "Why would you take such a risk?" Vaughn looked out over the land, his expression thoughtful. "San Angelo needs more than just cattle and cotton. It needs culture, education. A good bookshop would benefit everyone." He paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps I have my own selfish reasons for wanting you to stay." Before Fiona could ask what he meant, he continued more briskly, "You'd have complete control of the shop's operations. I'd simply be a silent partner until you've repaid the investment. After that, it would be entirely yours." The offer was generous, more than generous, and Fiona found herself tempted, yet something held her back from immediate acceptance. "May I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Vaughn agreed readily. "Take all the time you need." They worked a while longer, loading the salvaged items into the buggy, then prepared to return to Vaughn's ranch as the afternoon waned. "One more thing," Fiona said as they were about to leave. "Why were you riding this way last night? Your ranch is in the opposite direction from town." Vaughn looked uncomfortable for the first time that day. "I told you something didn't feel right." "But why come here at all?" Fiona pressed. "The cabin was secure, the fire banked properly." "There was no reason to check on me." Vaughn busied himself with the horse's harness, avoiding her gaze. "I was concerned about your first night alone, that's all." Fiona stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm to still his movements. "Vaughn, please tell me the truth." He sighed, finally meeting her eyes. "The truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about you, about how it felt when you weren't at the boarding house this morning, about how quiet the cabin would seem without." He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words, "without you in it." The simple admission sent warmth coursing through Fiona's chest. "I felt the same way," she confessed softly. "The cabin seemed empty without you there." Something shifted in Vaughn's expression, a guardedness giving way to cautious hope. "Fiona," a shout from the road interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They turned to see a rider approaching at a gallop. Deanna Palmer, her blonde hair streaming behind her. "Vaughn," she called as she drew closer. "I heard about the fire. Is everyone all right?" Vaughn's expression closed again as he stepped away from Fiona. "We're fine, Deanna. What brings you out this way?" Deanna dismounted gracefully, her concerned gaze moving between them. "News travels fast in San Angelo. Father sent me to offer assistance." Her eyes lingered on Fiona's attire, still Vaughn's oversized shirt over her nightgown. "Though it appears you've found accommodations already." The implication in her tone was unmistakable, and Fiona felt her cheeks flush with indignation. "Mr. Mitchell kindly offered shelter after I lost everything in the fire," she said stiffly. "It was an emergency situation." "Of course," Deanna replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "How fortunate that Vaughn was nearby again." She turned to Vaughn. Father wants you to know that if Miss Adams needs financial assistance with rebuilding, the bank would be happy to discuss terms. That's very kind, Fiona interjected before Vaughn could respond, but I'm still considering my options. Deanna's gaze sharpened. Don't consider too long. Winter's coming and building takes time. She looked pointedly at the ruins of the cabin. It would be a shame to lose this lovely property after inheriting it so recently. I have no intention of losing it, Fiona assured her. I'm glad to hear it, Deanna replied. San Angelo needs more. Permanent residents. She mounted her horse with practiced ease. Do let us know if you decide to accept Father's offer of assistance. The bank is always looking for sound investments. With that, she turned her horse and rode away, leaving Fiona and Vaughn in uncomfortable silence. She's right about one thing, Vaughn finally said. Winter is coming and decisions will need to be made soon. Fiona nodded, the moment of intimacy they'd shared before Deanna's arrival seeming distant now. Let's go back to your ranch, I need time to think. The return journey passed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Vaughn busied himself with the horse while Fiona went inside to wash up. Standing in Vaughn's spare room, surrounded by his things, Fiona tried to sort through her jumbled emotions. Twice now she had lost nearly everything to fire. Twice Vaughn Mitchell had rescued her. Was it mere coincidence, as he'd suggested, or something more, some pattern the universe was trying to show her, and what of Vaughn himself? His offer of financial help was generous, but it was his admission that he couldn't stop thinking about her that truly gave Fiona pause. In the short time since her arrival in San Angelo, she had developed feelings for this quiet, honorable man that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. The question was whether those feelings were reciprocated in equal measure, and whether she was ready to risk her heart after so much other loss. By the time Fiona emerged from the bedroom, Vaughn had prepared a simple supper. They ate mostly in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken words. I've been thinking about your offer, Fiona said finally, setting down her fork. Vaughn looked up, his expression carefully neutral. And, I appreciate your generosity, but I can't accept it. Fiona held up a hand when he started to object. Not as it stands. A loan implies distance, a purely business arrangement. She took a deep breath. And I think we both know there's more between us than that. Vaughn went very still, his dark eyes intent on her face. What are you suggesting? A true partnership, Fiona said boldly. In all things. For a long moment, Vaughn didn't respond, and Fiona feared she'd misread the situation entirely. Then slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair and came around the table to stand before her. Fiona Adams, he said, his voice rough with emotion, are you proposing to me? A smile tugged at her lips despite her nervousness. I believe I am. Is that terribly forward of me? Vaughn reached for her hand, drawing her to her feet. Terribly, he agreed, his eyes warming. But then, you've never done things the conventional way, have you? Is that a yes? Fiona asked, her heart pounding. In answer, Vaughn drew her closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. I've wanted to do this since the night I pulled you from that burning wagon, he murmured, and then his lips were on hers, gentle yet insistent. Fiona melted into the kiss, her arms twining around his neck as years of loneliness and weeks of uncertainty dissolved in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his chest. I'll take that as a yes, she whispered. Vaughn's chuckle rumbled through his chest. Yes, Fiona Adams. I would be honored to build a life with you, to rebuild your cabin, to help create your bookshop, to face whatever comes next together. Even if it means more fires, she asked, only half joking. Especially then, he said seriously. Though I'd prefer if we limited those to the hearth from now on. They spoke long into the night, planning their future together, the bookshop that would bring literature to San Angelo, the rebuilt cabin that would become their home, the life they would create together out of the ashes of loss. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, Fiona Adams became Fiona Mitchell in a simple ceremony at the San Angelo church. Harriet Thornton wept openly, while Eduardo and his family cheered. Even Diana Palmer attended, her congratulations seeming genuine if somewhat resigned. By spring, the new cabin was complete, larger and sturdier than the original, with a proper stone foundation and metal stove pipes that Vaughn insisted on checking weekly. The bookshop opened on Main Street to great local interest, with a lending library section that quickly became a gathering place for the community. Vaughn continued to run his ranch, but found time each day to stop by the shop, sometimes bringing lunch, other times simply sitting in the corner with a book, content to be in Fiona's presence as she built her dream. On the first anniversary of the night her wagon had caught fire, Fiona and Vaughn sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant orange and gold. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Fiona asked, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. If you hadn't been riding by that night, if you hadn't pulled me from the flames, Vaughn's arm tightened around her. I try not to dwell on what might have been, he said, but I do thank God every day that I was there. As do I, Fiona murmured. She placed her hand over his, guiding it to rest on her slightly rounded belly. All three of us do. Vaughn's expression transformed with wonder as he felt the first fluttering movements of their child beneath his palm. 3, he repeated, the word a benediction. From ashes to life, Fiona said softly. That seems to be our pattern, doesn't it? A good pattern, Vaughn agreed, drawing her closer. One I'm happy to continue for all our days. As darkness fell around them, the warm light from their cabin windows spilled out onto the porch, a different kind of fire, one that nurtured rather than destroyed, one that would guide them home through whatever adventures lay ahead. For Fiona Mitchell, who had twice watched flames consume her possessions, the most precious things could never be burned away: love, hope, and the promise of a future brighter than any she could have imagined that night when her wagon caught fire and a cowboy pulled her to safety.